Hello, hello, hello! This is LabCat, and welcome back. Today I'll probably talk about why socialism, and most notably communism, is vastly misunderstood today. So, there's a few different prominent examples. There's the Soviet Union, there's Venezuela, and their whole issue, and there is Vietnam. Those are the three that I know the situation behind the most. And even then, I might still get some details wrong. All I'm going to really say, as a premise first and foremost, is that I don't particularly support socialism or communism, merely that the common image of them is wrong. And that's because the image that people have of them is wrong. The Soviet Union. That largely came about following the Russian Revolution that was led by, who was it? Vladimir Lenin, I believe? Point is, it was Lenin. He was largely inspired by Karl Marx, who was also Russian. But the part that people seem to forget is that Joseph Stalin was not supposed to take over the Soviet Union after Lenin. It was supposed to be Trotsky. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Russian. Point is, Joseph Stalin was not supposed to take over, and when he did, he effectively made it I want to say like an oligarchy or an autocracy, but the point is that he pretty much made it a dictatorship. The party was in power, and that's about it. And that's the part that people seem to forget. That the Soviet Union, its earliest history and its first major leader was a dictator. And so every person after that followed in that person's footsteps. That's just the way things are. But Joseph Stalin wasn't supposed to be the leader. It was supposed to be someone else. It was supposed to be who Lenin designated to be the next leader. And that's the part that people forget. I believe that it was the dictatorship that ruined the communist movement in Russia, and not the fact that it was communist. Just trying to equate failure to a proposed economic system that at the end of the day was more of the state outright taking control of everything isn't right. Communism and socialism itself are designed and supposed to be managed largely by the workers themselves. That is, like we here in America certainly don't subscribe to that idea at all. The people in the education and finance department have no history of actually teaching or managing business. So, communism is supposed to work off the idea that the people that are a part of the production, that the people who the policies affect the most, those people are the ones making the policies. Farmers aren't supposed to be told what to grow, but rather simply that they are the more or less only supposed to sell it back to the government, and then the government will distribute it, which is kind of what large corporations do. The only difference is they farm it for themselves and then they ship it where they want. Again, not that socialism or communism is right. I'm just trying to point out that it is not inherently wrong, merely that it was mispracticed. Next, I'm going to talk about Vietnam. Vietnam, we got into a war. The primary reason why we got into the war to begin with was to defend democracy and capitalism from the northern part of Vietnam, the communist side, from taking over. I think we were in the wrong. Simple as that. And it's not to fight for capitalism or fight against communism. No, it's merely because we're fighting for the wrong side. I believe that if we were to have supported the northern side, the communists, we would be great allies with Vietnam. The reason for this is that the southern side, the capitalist side, the leaders there were incredibly corrupt. Like, I could describe a few different things, like the guy hooking up with a whole bunch of women, wasting a large amount of public funds, disregarding the public's needs. Point is, that guy wasn't even like properly voted in anyway. So we were basically trying to support a terrible leader who wasn't leading the country, and that is just a outright sign of failure. The communist side was, to my knowledge, publicly supported. Like, if you had a national poll, it would be the majority of people would support the communist side. And that's merely because those people were trying to actually help others. The fact that we got in the way of that, I believe, is a terrible mistake. In fact, we ended up effectively losing that war. And technically speaking, it wasn't a war. Congress never even signed off that it was a war. Just the president sent in troops and Congress allowed it. We were never actually at war with them. It's terrible, really. Vietnam, trying to force other countries to be capitalist, in my opinion, is terrible. Other countries have different circumstances. For here in America, most people are first-class citizens, and by that I mean citizens in a first-world country. That is, at the forefront of technology, they possess a very strong manufacturing base. That is, they don't need many people to produce a lot. And the majority of their economy is supported by services rather than actual physical labor. Much unlike Vietnam at the time, which you could classify quite easily as being a second world country. Half the country was in this like semi-first world state, and then the rest of it was in a third world state. Small rural villages that had very little understanding of the world at large because they didn't have the time or ability to really exert resources to learning about their surroundings, as that time was better spent focusing on their individual circumstances. That is not a very conducive environment to grow a country starting with capitalism. My biggest point of this is that, like, every European country, when they were in that same kind of state, utilized feudalism, which is like, well, for one, it's much closer to communism and socialism for sure. Actually, it's much closer to communism, not socialism, where a single leader gets a whole lot of power, or a group of leaders rather, and they delegate resources outwards. People as laborers and individuals do not get much authority in of themselves, which to me makes a country capitalist, that you as an individual have a large amount of autonomy. Lastly is the most recent instance of socialism being implemented and heavily failing, which is Venezuela. I hope the light's not too bright. I'm really sorry for that. Venezuela has a unique set of circumstances behind it. The leader of that country, well, the leader who implemented all of these socialist policies was he was one of the richest people in the world. A lot of his policies were fundamentally paid for out of pocket by himself. That's how much he cared for other people. That's how much he cared for actually helping the country. The problem is, he skyrocketed the position of Venezuela from a second world country into a first world country purely off of imports. So the country had a very strong establishment, a very strong base that focused and required the importation of resources and exportation of money. So when that leader died, and all of his money was more or less spent anyway, the country was out of options. The only option then would be to take on debts and loans, which exacerbates the problem. So the point is, he created a country where people benefited without having to do work. So the country itself grew artificially, and that's why it, at least in my opinion, that's the biggest reason why it collapsed. The leader who followed him, also like the Joseph Stalin case, was not the intended following leader. He wasn't like the number one candidate that first guy would have liked, but that's the guy who got elected, which resulted in a large amount of corruption, resources being misallocated, an inflation of government money to pay off the debts. That, in my opinion, is what collapsed that country. Not the fact that it was socialist, merely the fact that they didn't actually grow their economy. They just took a multi-billion-dollar enterprise and funneled that money into the economy. It's kind of like if Jeff Bezos single-handedly decided to pay for a welfare system across the country. Sure, it's a great idea, and the government doesn't have to pay for it, but what happens when Jeff Bezos dies? The money gets turned over to the estate, and the estate refuses to pay for the program anymore. Well, there's a lot of people who are probably going to say that the government was paying for it, so the government will have to start paying for it at that point. That's where this problem really started. Benefits were given out that the government itself couldn't pay for. The economy at large couldn't support it to begin with, and the entire thing collapsed in on itself. Any little bit of economic and business know-how would know that this would have happened. After all, like if you were to look at it from a construction perspective, it's like building a house on top of a swamp without a foundation. At some point, the house will sink into the swamp, you just don't know when. You can keep putting in supports and keep trying to build the support underneath the already existing house, but it's hard. It's really hard. And it's for those reasons that I believe that communism had failed there. It's not because it itself was communism that failed it. It's merely the circumstances that generated the communism to begin with. Rather, it's the circumstances that perpetuated the system. Joseph Stalin, he perpetuated the communist regime that Lenin started, which Joseph Stalin had zero intent on actually running a communist country. Merely a dictatorship, really. With the incident of Vietnam, we as a country, America, opted to intervene. Sorry, there's a biker and there's no shoulder, so I have to cross the double yellow to get around him. We as a country, America, opted to intervene in another country's affairs to force their economy to change to fit what we want it to be. And it will not work. That's just a fact. You can't force another country to conform to a certain system and expect it to work. There's enough evidence of that. Look at Iraq and other nation-building projects that we've attempted and failed at over and over. And lastly, there's Venezuela, where the country was built up and supported by someone's personal funds, the leader's personal funds, and not the country as a whole, the system, the government, the taxes, actually being able to support the programs that were implemented, because it came all out of pocket. It's for those reasons that I just want to clarify again, it's not that I support communism or socialism, it's merely that I think it's vastly misunderstood. I don't think it will really work here in America, merely because of the disparity between service workers and manufacturers and farmers. That is, the amount of farmers that there are in America don't make for a communist system just for farming. A large majority of them are farms, are ran by major companies that probably make up more than 70% of the market. And that is not a very conducive system for communism. Communism depends on having a large number of workers, wherein the service sector is really small. And the majority of people own their own means of production and their own means of growing. That is, small family farms and small family manufacturing plants. Like if you just had a lathe and a mill at home, so you just create things at home, like blocks or something for children. Point is, you need a lot of mom and pop shops in order to make communism work. That's my belief. That's my opinion. I just wanted to put it out there to you, the listener, that's my opinion, that communism and socialism is misunderstood. It's got to be said a lot for you to understand that it's not that I don't necessarily support it, merely that I want to get out more of the truth of the situations behind those things. With that, I'm going to cut it off here. I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you've got anything to say, please put a comment down in the bottom. I look at all of them. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Ring that bell so you can get notifications. This has been Lapcat. I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.